All right, so we left off with the idea about how do we start thinking about these objects and being able to think about them in terms of private versus public. How do we look at how we create these objects? So make sure you've read and worked through the chapter. While this is interesting and fun, it's a new concept for a lot of people, and it is one of the tougher ideas to kind of wrap our head around until you've worked with it a little bit. So we're leaving off or starting on about page 232. We looked very briefly at something called a static method. In other words, we could create something and pass it to all of the instances of a class through static methods. In other words, through that class that led to the object. Well, what we want to look at is the idea of encapsulation. So we first peeked at that when we looked at functions, but we're going to look at it again. So think about if we created bank accounts, or we created your student account here at Peru, and we wanted everybody to have their own object. So you became an object here at Peru. Well, I don't want everybody to be able to directly access your financial aid information. I don't want them to be able to access information about you, in other words, so your social security information, your grades, all of those things we want to have some way to encapsulate, and we have some methods to do that. And so we're going to look at these a little bit. So inside of Python, we have what, and in most object-oriented software or programming languages are the same, we have something called a public and a private attribute. So a private attribute then is those kinds of things that we can create that are only available if we know certain information. So we can access them from inside the object, we can pass them in and out, but I can't necessarily grab them very easily. And so if I look on page 234, we start looking at how do we create a private attribute. So the very first thing we're going to do is, like in all of our objects, or almost all of them, the most common thing we're always going to do is we're going to start out with that idea of that constructor. And in Python, we use that function, that underscored init or initialization, to create something. So notice when we create these, though, if we do a to underscore, so same as what we did with the initiation, it's these little functions we have. So let's take a peek. So what I'm looking at is I'm creating an object. So the first thing I do is I'm going to create a constructor. So in other words, as soon as we create an object, it runs this set of functions. And so it's going to have three variables: self, name, and mood. Okay. So here, self.name equals name. All right, so that's what we've done before. That's a public attribute. Now notice here, though, we said self.__mood. And those double underscores tell us that we're going to create a private attribute. And that private attribute is going to be mode. Okay. So we're going to, we can access that. So in other words, I can, from a talk function inside, so I run a function that's contained inside of that object, I can get those values back out of private. So I define a talk. So here's our talk function, and it prints I am blank. And notice it, I feel, and it's got the mood in there. So that's one way we can return it. Okay. So That's one way we can access those functions. So if I tried to access it from external, I'm going to end up with an attribute that says, hey, it doesn't exist. And you can see that on the bottom of page 234. So a private attribute, so we can also do that. So at the bottom of page 235, so this is our private attribute. So again, we start that with that double underscore to show that we're creating a private method. And here we defined one called public method. Okay. So we can create both public and private methods. In other words, things that we can execute internally or externally. So let's take a look and let's run this and see what happens. So if I run, so we created a new critter. So here's where we created that critter. And we said critter name equals Poochie, mood equals happy. So that's the values we're passing into that. So crit talk, so we come up here and we'd call the talk function, says I am Poochie, right now I feel happy. And so it's able to access that private function. So crit talk works. So crit public method, now this is where it's a little funky. So notice we created a private method and then we created a public method inside of this that, notice what it does. It accesses that private method. So it's just a way to show that we're able to access that. So that is where we get the line, this is a public method. So in other words, it activates this. And then it activates this piece because it runs this line. So self.private. So if I had tried, and so let's just put it in there. So if I had tried, so in other words, I'm trying to call this private piece directly. Let's see what happens. And it's going to run module, yes. Aha, so it runs through and it ran public method and then it says, hey, critter object has no attribute. Because it's a private method, I can't even access it directly from external. And so that's good. So it gives us that ability to hide things inside of these objects and keep them from prying eyes. So it's a little harder than just writing a generic piece of code and say, I want to extract all of the student IDs from all of these objects from this object class. We can't do that quite as easily. So how do we know when we want to use privacy and when we don't? Because quite frankly, if we set everything public, that makes our lives easier when we code our program. We don't have to worry about any, we can access it directly, we don't have to worry about it, and it's a bad habit to get into. So we try to keep as many things private as possible. So on the bottom of page 237 are a couple of tips and hints. So we want to try when we write our program to minimize the need for these clients to directly access attributes. So we want to try to not directly address private and public methods. And it gives us some ability then to obfuscate from the common user or another program, so this becomes a module inside of a larger program. And it gives us that ability to hide things a little bit. So notice when I tried this, even though I know what it's called private method, I couldn't actually get it to run external to the code or to that object. So these objects are pretty powerful. We get to do some interesting things. Well, we can also do something called creating properties. And so properties are an interesting thing. Right click that. So on page 238, we start looking at how do we control access to these properties. And so on the bottom of page 238 and the beginning of page 239, we're going to define a new critter object. And so this one looks very similar. Class critter. Here we have our constructor, and we're only having the name. Okay. So we notice we even keep the name though, right there. Self underscore name. Okay. And notice now we're adding something a little different on the next line. And we're adding the app property. So the app property then gives us a way we can start writing and tell what things we have private access to and what things we have public access to. And so we can also then provide read access to a property. In theory, we can provide read, write, create, update access to a private attribute through a property. Generally, the most common thing we do is provide read-only access. So in other words, we can read but not alter, and that's a pretty common thing we do. So name at name.setter. So here we define name, and we have a new name. So in other words, here we're allowing it to change names. So in other words, we are allowing that ability to change this private attribute. So let's see what it looks like. So in other words, we run and it says a new critter's been born. So same thing we've done. It tells us that we've created a class. Hi, I'm Poochie. My critter's name is Poochie. So if we come down here, we create a critter named Poochie and we ask it to talk. So in other words, that's where it says, hi, I'm Poochie. This is done in the constructor. This is done down in the main where we called crit talk. And here we say my critter's name is Poochie. Print my critter's name is, and then we have crit name. Okay. Attempting to change my name to Randolph. So crit name equals Randolph. And because we have set that up with the name.setter, we use that .name function, and now we're changing to Randolph. So name change successful. So attempting to change my names, crit name equals Randolph. And notice it says, where does that name change happen? So here, all we're checking for is if it's an empty string. If it's not an empty string, then self underscore name equals new name. So it will change that name. So it's changed its name to Randolph. Attempting to change my critter's name to the empty string. So it tries to pass in an empty value. That's going to hit this if statement. It says, hey, it can't be an empty string, and it's not going to change anything. Well, so, and it's going to print that it's still Randolph. So we've changed an attribute that we set private by using the crit name function. And so that's one way we can control some access in there. There are other ways we could have done this very same thing. This is probably the easier way, but we could have put a function inside of here and called it and done some very similar things. So anytime we're going to set a property, we start with that @ symbol. So make sure you've worked through this and you start to understand how we can change these individual attributes. So we put in some kind of a block here because we don't really want a attribute that doesn't have a name in this particular case. So on page 242, we're going to start looking at creating a critter caretaker problem. And so this is a little more complicated. So we're going to combine all these attributes that we've looked at before. We're going to combine that ability to create a class. We're going to put several methods in there. So in other words, we're going to create several pieces that will allow us to manipulate this particular object that we've constructed. So if I look on page 242, we start with the idea that we're going to create a critter caretaker. So we're going to create a virtual pet. And so if you have kids, you've probably bought for them these little virtual pets, Zuzu pets or whatever they are. Well, this is kind of the same idea. We're going to create a small pet that has some attributes. So we're going to try passing them into it. So let me close this out and this out. Yes, I'll still. So we're going to take a look at this program very quickly and start constructing it. So once again, we're going to create a critter. So we define a class critter object, and we're going to call it our virtual pet. Great. So in this particular case, we have, once again, a constructor. And so that constructor has a couple of things in it. So we're going to pass in a name. We're going to pass in a value for hunger and one for boredom. And we know that pets, when they get bored, do bad things. So we want to avoid boredom. We don't want them to tear up our house. Okay. So these are all public. Notice we didn't use the underscore. So name, hunger, and boredom, and we do the dot notation. That way we can address them. So now we're going to have a private method internally that's going to allow us to pass time. So in other words, as time passes, hunger and boredom are both going to increase. So if I go too long, my pets get hungry, they get bored, and they want to do something. So it's a private function. In other words, it's got the two underscores. So self.hunger, and each time we call this, it's going to increase by 1. And notice we started at 0. So they're going to go up by 1. And then a mood property. Well, let's look at this mood. So depending on the values of this mood, your pet is either going to be happy, okay, frustrated, or mad. So just as you get happy, frustrated, and mad based on how many times your program doesn't run correctly, here we're going to do that based on values that we generated up here. So as time goes on, they're going to go from happy. So if it's less than 5, they're going to be happy. If they're between 6 and 10, they're going to be okay. 11 to 15, they're going to be frustrated, and over that, they're going to be mad. And so notice what we're doing here. We're assigning, so we take in unhappiness equals self-hunger plus self-boredom. So it takes the combination of those two. So initially, that first value is going to be 0 plus 0. If those two conditions are true, then it's going to say m equals happy. So we're adding another variable, and what we do is we pass that variable m back out. So whether they're happy, okay, frustrated, or mad is going to be returned out by this value of m. So we have a talk, which is a pretty common thing that we use. Even if we don't necessarily need it to output something, we sometimes will put this in as a troubleshooting tool. So we'll have a talk method. So print, I'm whoever I am, and I feel blank. So it's going to take that self mood. So where do we come up with self mood? And pass it back out. And when it does, so when it runs, it prints this. So I am blank and I feel blank. I'm going to pass out, or I'm going to then run that pastime function. So it runs talk, and then it comes up and runs this. So we have a couple of other things we're going to have in there. So we have an eat. So if an eat, when we eat, we automatically set the food to 4. Okay. And so the value for food is 4, and then so self-hunger becomes whatever the value is minus food. If it's less than 0, so in other words, if we came in with a 2, it's going to reset it to 0. So we don't go into negative numbers. And then notice, after we eat, it passes it back and runs another pastime. So immediately after we eat, we run this function again. Well, here we have a play function. And so the play does something very similar, but it does it with the boredom function. So we're taking off 4 units. And so if self-boredom is less than 0, so in other words, we can't have negative boredom, so that is our methods for manipulating our object. So here we have a couple of choices. So we're going to create a menu. So we'll create that menu inside a while loop. So notice it's got some options here. So while choice does not equal 0, so in other words, 0 is our quit, we can listen to the critter, feed my critter, or play with my critter. And so it calls those methods. So if it's a 0, it's going to say goodbye. Elif, it's going to do choice 1 and call crit talk. So if I want to listen, it's going to call crit talk. And notice that crit talk, every time it calls it, it also runs pastime. So we'll watch those values decline just based on running that talk function. So then we have the option to feed your critter or play with your critter. And if you type in anything else, it's going to give you an error. So that's our while loop for our program. Here we're constructing our critter. What do you want to name your critter? And it's going to pass in that crit name that we have defined. So let's run it, and let's see if it does actually work as we think it might. So what do I want to name my critter? objects, we're going to name our critter Selfie. So once we name it, then we pass into that menu. Well, I want to listen to my critter. I'm Selfie and I feel happy. So we run it again. I feel happy. I feel happy. I feel happy. Oh, now notice now, because we've started increasing those values, now they're just okay. So I'm going to run it out. Now they're getting frustrated. And so now notice they're in the mad stage. So I'm going to now feed my critter. And it tells me burp, thank you. And I'm going to play with my critter. And I'm going to feed him and play with him one more time. And I'm going to say, I want to listen now. And so now they're back up to frustrated. They're no longer mad. So I'd have to do it a couple of more times. And now we'll listen to him. And now we're back up to happy again. So this is just a way. Now right now we don't have a timer in there that works other than every time we listen to our pet, it gives us a value. So let's look at this again really quickly. So we define our pet same way we've done everything before. So we have our constructor, and again it sets a couple of values. So everything in here is our constructor. We have a pastime, which just changes that boredom and hunger. And we can play with those numbers. If you want to do it more, you can change those. We have a mood function. So in other words, now we've defined mood. And notice here then, once we've defined that mood, I can print out self.mood because we created that as an app property. Isn't that pretty slick? So we can just construct that. Now, could we actually make it print its values for self-boredom and self-hunger? Yes. And we might want to do that as a troubleshooting technique. So we have a couple of things in here. We have its eat function and its play function. And so really this doesn't look that hard once we look at it. It's actually easier than some of the things we've done in the past, I think, once we've ran this program and we start to understand. The difficulty is we're working with these objects. And so we could create, so let me go back down here to our main. So we could construct more than one critter name, and they would work independently. So we could have 12 different pets, and we could feed and water and take care of them independently. Now, in this particular case, we're not set up to that, but we could certainly do that. So this ability to create these objects, it takes a little more foreplanning, but once we create these, we can start doing all kinds of things with them. And in fact, we're going to do that next week. We're going to do some more with it, and we're going to introduce you to how to create a blackjack game. So make sure you work through these and you start working through these. We don't talk about nearly every method with objects. And the reality is, as each version of Python changes just slightly, some of these might change. The basic methodology, how we construct one, we use a constructor, how we create that class. So in other words, we're creating a class up here called critter, which creates objects. Our main function now is pretty simple. We're calling main, and it runs a main function. And this is very common. We create this idea of a loop. So we're trying to create these classes that work very much like real objects. So your assignment this week, if I remember right, is we're going to modify this program. And so look at what ways we can modify it. If you really, really, really feel like you want to try to do some slightly harder things, notice that all the way down on the challenges on number 4 is create a critter farm program where we have several objects and keep track of them. So if you've played Farmville on Facebook, it works very similar to that. You have a bunch of independent objects, and how do I maintain them? So there's modules in there. We could put timer modules in there, so even if we didn't list, just over time, it would change those boredom and hunger levels. So we may think of other ways to modify this program. So I am working my way through your homework. Some of you did very well, and some of you got frustrated and had some issues. So I'll make sure you look in the discussion board where people have posted their work. And even those ones that didn't work, some of them were very, very, very close and had some interesting ideas about how we could change this program to accommodate our needs. All right, so make sure you work through this. This will take you some time. So I will warn you that I have both of my girls this weekend, so I will probably be a little slower to respond. So on Sunday night at 9 o'clock, if you start asking questions, it'll be very difficult for me to respond to that and give you any kind of constructive help. But the flip side of this, if you work your way through this chapter, previous students have actually done better than in this chapter once they've worked through. But you have to work through and be able to create these objects on your own. So go out and pull this code that comes with the chapter, work on it on your own, try to come up with some methods, and I will try to make some comments and some other things in there about which programs work. But look through those discussion boards. That's for your benefit and for your usage to try to find out how did we get these programs to work. All right, have a wonderful weekend and enjoy all the rain we're getting.